Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to meet with you again. And this time we are going to discuss something interesting, I think, as always. Uh, and when you read this title, The Charming Cheater in the Litter, uh, it's not that I'm trying to be humorous. When using this word cheater, I want to pay your attention that this is the official term used for these plants in biology, but we will, of course, discuss it in more detail while we proceed. So let us start and admire as a start this beautiful view. This is, by the way, in Miles Standish State Forest. As you know it probably by now, this is my favorite forest, and it harbors beauties like that along with everything else. And this photograph was taken in mid-autumn. That was mid-October. So I'm not going to start with this plant because it is relatively rare, but I hope that you could recognize the creature in this photograph. At least some of you must have observed it in the woods nearby because it's relatively common. I should just say, put it more bluntly, it is common around here. And it is living in the litter, as you can also see. So I wasn't really cheating with the title. So this is, of course, the famous Indian pipe, because you see a group of strangely pale, in fact, white flowers, but actually each stalk is a separate plant. So an individual plant consists of one stem and a single nodding flower. It's a charming creature and it's very bizarre. People approached me on walks and I had funny conversations times and again. For example, one person said, "Hey, Irina, are you good with your mushrooms?" I'm like, "No, why?" And he said, "Can you identify this mushroom for me?" So people uh, customarily take this plant for a mushroom, but meanwhile, this is a totally normal flowering plant with the flower and the fruit and the flowering stalk. The only thing that is missing here is this green color. Chlorophyll is missing. In every other respect, it's just another flowering plant. So many people have been fascinated by its looks, and it's eerie and strange, and that's why another name for it is ghost plant and even corpse plant. For example, Emily Dickinson admired this flower to the extent that it was on the cover of her poetry, Poems by Emily Dickinson. And you see that there is easily recognizable Indian pipe here. And also, here is Emily Dickinson's authentic autograph with this poem that I guess it was more like a riddle because it starts with a reference to the Indian pipe, but it doesn't really tell you what the poem is all about. "'Tis whiter than an Indian pipe, 'tis dimmer than a lace, no stature has it, like a fog when you approach the place. and so on and so on. And it starts with it is. And if you think about it, what she was talking about, um, I guess it was the human spirit or the human soul. She was actually comparing with the Indian pipe. Uh, in another poem of another poet, woman poet, um, Indian pipe becomes the central object of the poem, and it's called Ghost Flowers. The author of this poem is a woman who lived a little later, about the same time. This book was published a little later, though, in 1904. And the author is Mary Potter Thatcher Higginson. I like her four-part last name. I mean, three-part last name. Potter Thatcher Higginson. The first part is her father's last name, second is her mother's, and the third is her husband's. And she actually lived in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, after her marriage to the noted historian and abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and she produced his biography later on, became his biographer. But she also was a poet and wrote this about ghost flowers, as she called them. See, she even had Latin name here in the title, Monotropa uniflora, and that's the Latin name that is still current. It hasn't been changed in any way. So this is our first encounter with the Latin name for this flower we're talking about. But let's read the poem. In shining groups, each stem a pearly ray, weird flecks of light within the shadowed wood, they dwell aloof, a spotless sisterhood. No angels except the wild bird's lay awakes these foreign nuns. Yet night and day their heads are bent as if in prayerful mood. I don't know about you. Uh, I had one word that was unfamiliar for me with bird's lay. So when I first read it, I thought that the birds were pooping on the flower. That's how I understood the word lay. But then I looked it up and realized that lay just means the bird's song, not at all anything material. But anyway, I think it's a very poetic representation of the Indian pipe and the way her flowers very timidly look down, nodding like this. But let's return from poetry to science, and let's consider how in the world these creatures survive in this world without chlorophyll, and why did I say that they were cheaters? Well, some of you may recall our one of my previous conversations with you regarding the orchids. And we talked about the environment in the woods, how the entire wood floor is pierced with very, very thin threads of mushroom that produced by mushrooms. And they send this network of thin rays through the soil, and the entire soil is bursting with this mushroom network, which is invisible to us because the threads are very thin. And what we collect as mushrooms on the surface of the soil are only the fruiting bodies of the mushroom. But what's the most important and how mushroom survives and propagates itself and conquers the world is this invisible thread. This is called mycelium, and the threads themselves are called hyphas. And these are very intimately connected with the trees under which the mushrooms grow. And this connection is very meaningful for the entire forest and for the species that are connected, because trees and mushrooms exchange substances. Trees send down the sugars that they make in the leaves towards their roots. And the mycelium is connected to tree roots and takes in some of the sugars which the mushroom needs. And in turn, the mushroom, through the mycelium connected to the roots of the tree, sends to the tree some um, inorganic substances uh, diluted in water. So this is beneficial both to the tree and to the fungus with which it is connected. It's mutually beneficial. So this type of relationship is called mutualism. But of course, they are not trying to be polite or helpful to the other species. Each species lives in order to survive and benefits only itself. It just happens in nature uh, that it just happened so that what is beneficial in this case for certain organism is to be connected with another organism, and that works mutually. This is one type of relationships in nature as opposed to competition, which is another type of relationship. So, how does monotropa or Indian pipe enter this dialogue between the mushroom and the tree? Well, uh, the matter is that the Indian pipe can connect to the mushroom hyphas and to the mycelium and steal a little bit from the mushroom, which means in turn stealing from the tree. So imagine there is a pipe uh, and the oil is going down the pipe from one country to the next. And someone living close by, some cheater, makes a little hole and fills his engine in his car by just taking a little bit of the oil illegally. And that's what these um, these plants happen to do. This is not very uncommon in the natural world. So many plants are connected with mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza is like the internet, the underground internet that connects everything with everything in the woods. And that's, I think, how the information also literally the information um, flows from one creature to the next. This is through this invisible hyphas of, uh, of the fungus. And so uh, Indian pipe is not the only plant that um, benefits and can steal from this network. But the difference is that this plant doesn't give back anything in return. It only takes, it doesn't provide anything for anyone. So it's a very useful adaptation. So in this situation, when the plant can easily receive ready sugars and all the substances it needs, it seems as though it doesn't need to produce its own sugar. So chlorophyll in this situation is like a useless commodity, and you can just get rid of it and exist without it, as well as roots. You don't need even roots. You can see that it starts from some uh, shapeless clump, and this clump in the picture is actually uh, like a dense clump of mycelium from the fungus, and there are no roots involved here. So you can imagine that how could that happen to the plant? How this structure uh, could have evolved in the evolutionary process? So we know how evolution proceeds with mutations. So the entire world is a large sandbox of nature. So nature is playing with the evolution with mutations. So from time to time, it through recombination of genes, it produces something new, something different. And most of these mutations are lethal, meaning that these creatures cannot leave any progeny and cannot survive because they are not well adapted to the environment. But what if environment is changing, and then in the new environment, this one of these occasional mutations actually works well, and the creature survives and is able to leave progeny. And so we can imagine that that's what happened once to the Indian pipes. They probably, their ancestors probably were green. In fact, they were green, but then there occurred this freak mutation where a plant lost its chlorophyll. And this plant all of a sudden didn't die but survived because they were already attached to this underground network of nutritional value. And that's how we can imagine something like Indian pipe just came into being. But let's go on and look at exactly which mushrooms Indian pipe can be connected to. It turns out they are very simple, very common mushrooms that we see all around uh, each time we go into the woods in summer. They are brittle gills, all kinds of brittle gills. I'm showing here three kinds, but actually there are more species of brittle gills, which in Latin are called rassula. So more species of rassula with which Indian pipe can make this productive connection. And also another group of mushrooms are lactarius mushrooms or birch milk caps. These are inedible mushrooms, but brittle gills are quite tasty if you, you know, fry them on a frying pan with potatoes or make soup. They're very good and you can collect and eat them. But again, we have to remember that these are only the fruiting bodies of the fungus, and the fungus itself, its major part, is invisible for us. It is underground. And that's what is connecting this fungus with trees and with other plants in the forest. So fungus plays a major role in the forest, even though it doesn't seem like that at the first glance. And what are those invisible hyphae? How we could imagine, how we put an image on them? So that's what I'm talking about. This is what hyphae look under the microscope. These are threads whose diameter is about 5 micrometers or microns, and the length is on average 30 microns. Now, this photograph is a little bit of cheating because it wasn't taken in, it wasn't um, taken in the soil, but rather it's the surface of the mushroom, because the upper layers of every mushroom head also consist of hypha. There's a hypha layer. So it's not, the hyphas are not only very thin threads that are penetrating through the soil, but they end up in the mushrooms, what we call mushrooms themselves, that is in the fruiting bodies of the fungus, and they form this outer layer. And that's that outer layer of the actual mushroom that's photographed here. But it helps us to kind of imagine what these threads, mushroom threads, are all about. But let's go back to our Indian pipes. Um, these airy flowers are going to show up in the forest pretty soon, actually. The first of them are observed usually in our environment here in eastern Massachusetts by the end of this month. You see, this photograph is dated June 29th. So some of you who go out walking around here may be lucky and observe this kind of thing in the wild, because it's pretty common around here. And you see that the flowers are very touching. There are these nodding heads and pinkish stems, or sometimes it's bluish. The color is variable. And this is just your normal flower. The only thing that is missing here are leaves, green leaves. Instead of green leaves, you can see there are on this flower stalk, there are bracts, like kind of scales. The upper two bracts are making this cute bow under the flower. And the flower has sepals and petals just like any other flower. And it is pollinated by bees and bumblebees, and they love it. Usually you see a lot of bumblebees on them, on these flowers. Now this is in July, as you can see, and it keeps flowering. Actually, the flowering is going on until the very late fall. But those flowers who show up earlier, they of course develop quicker and produce fruits. And what happens in fruit, that the flower turns and becomes upright. You should stop calling it a flower, and now it becomes a fruit. Also, what happens to it, it loses all the petals and sepals, and all is left are the stamens that become naked, so you can take a better look at them. These are the stamens. And the pistil, whose ovary grows into this plump fruit. And in fact, the Latin name monotropa consists of two parts, two roots. Mono means one, emphasizing that there is only a single flower on a single stalk. For each plant, it's just one. And tropa means turn in Latin. So emphasizing the fact that the flower turns and becomes upright when it ripens. So if you interpret the Latin name for the genus Monotropa, it means a single turning thing. I would say, put it this way. So it turns upright like that, and sometimes it becomes pink and quite colorful, and other times it remains white. And this fruiting stalk with this solitary fruit is very sturdy actually. As you can see in this photograph, it can even overwinter and remain upright and visible even during the next spring and into the next summer. And oftentimes, if you pay attention on what you step in the forest, you find them upright, standing amidst the forest litter, just like that. But the seeds by that time are already gone. And that process is also not easy to observe because the seeds are minuscule, just the same. Remember, we were talking about the teeny tiny seeds of orchids, and the seeds of orchids cannot even develop during uh, cannot even develop without producing contact with fungus mycelium, with the fungus hyphae. So the same, I believe, is true for Indian pipes because the seeds are so tiny, you cannot even see them properly. They're like dust when there are many. Each seed doesn't contain any nutrients for the initial development of the seedling, and so all the nutrients have to come from the fungus from the very beginning. No contact with the fungus, no germination. So the fact it germinates, that it germinates that way, I think tells a lot about its cryptic biology and the way it is so intimately connected with the fungus on which it grows. And here in the corner, you see a close-up view of this empty um, fruit fruit part that doesn't contain any seed and is just falling apart in April, later on in April. Now, if you look at the map of distribution of this plant in North America, you see that it is a very common plant in North America with a huge geographic area that is basically covering the entire continent except this little part in the southwest and the extreme northwest. The rest of the continent, all of Canada and all of the United States, are within the range of Monotropa uniflora or Indian pipe. And you can imagine that it must be more than that. And if you look at the worldwide distribution, you'll see, first of all, that beyond the United States, south of the United States, it goes into Mexico and into Central America and even into Northern South America. So the major range is here in the Western Hemisphere, but at the same time, part of the range, another large part of the range is here in Asia. And also it's quite enormous here from Japan and Korean Peninsula to India, all the way through China and other countries. And I thought you would have a kick of me showing you a very short video. It's less than 2 minutes. And in this video, a Chinese worker in the plant protection talks about his discovery of Indian pipe in Jiangxi province in China. It's all about, I guess, this yellow dot over here. And this is southeastern China. And from this short monologue, you'll find out that this plant is actually rare in that area. And it's fun to see how excited the guy is and how he celebrates his find of a large population of Indian pipe there in the neighborhood where he lives. It's all happening in the mountains. But let's listen to him speaking Chinese, but you will have some subtitles there, so you know what he's talking about.
我在这里生活了40多年，几乎第一次看到这种东西。我几乎每天来巡逻2次，上午一趟，下午一趟，来观察它的生长情况，确保它不被别人破坏。
大规模的群落更是罕见，它一般生长在多腐殖质的这个特殊环境里。它的株型呢比较矮小，非常奇特，通体洁白，它全身没有叶绿素，不进行光合作用，靠腐烂的植物来获得养分。
Now, I want you to look at another plant. You can guess that it belongs to the same group of plants, but this is not the same species. This one, you can tell this is of different color. It's not white, it's bright yellow or even orange, depending on the environment. And also, differently from Indian pipe, it is very fragrant, but here you have to believe me, because we cannot compare using this PowerPoint presentation. This is called pine sap here in the United States. And you see that it's a very apt name because it grows on the pines. You see these pine needles through which it it is developing through the layer of pine needles. And in Europe, it has a different name because it grows in Europe too. So it is called yellow bird's nest there. So I hope you recognize this cone. This is a white pine cone, and this is taking place in the white pine plantation in Miles Standish State Forest again. And this photograph tells us that this plant is as well pollinated by bees and bumblebees, the flowers, and also please pay attention to these blackening spots on the flowers. Well, blackening spot is also over here where the needle has touched the flower. So the story is that this beautiful white or yellow color is very unstable, and the flowers and the entire plant is very fragile actually. That refers to the Indian pipe as well as pine sap. And whenever something touches them, they become black like that. And when they are collected and dried for herbarium samples, the samples just normally go all black, and that's the only way to preserve this plant. So it's very easily going black, and hence the other name of Indian pipe, which is corpse plant. So this plant, if you pay attention to the original date here, July 20 something, that's 1 month later than Indian pipe. And in fact, I believe these plants are actually showing up and flowering later than Indian pipe on the whole. So the end of July, August, September, and October. So they have a shorter vegetation period a little bit. You can see again here that all these brown spots on the flowers, meaning that the flowers don't remain clean and nice for a long time and usually end up having these brown spots uh, later on in their lifetime, because inevitably they are touched by something during their lifetime. Here again, another example of a population of um, yellow colored uh, pine saps pollinated by bumblebee. And of course, you notice that the difference from the Indian pipe, very important difference, is that it's not one flower at one stalk, but a few flowers at a time. So it's not a solitary flower. And the environment here is different. It's not under pines. Here is an oak leaf here. I hope you recognize it now. It's one of those red oaks, remember, with pointed lobes and bristles at each point. So it was growing under red oaks at the shore of Weymouth Great Pond. And this photograph was actually taken in China by a woman who traveled to China with the American expedition, HUH, Harvard University Herbarium, participated in this expedition, and two people were representing Boston. It was a renowned professor, David Beaufort, very good, knowledgeable professor of botany that is the senior scientist at Harvard University Herbarium, and this woman, Susan Kelly, and I know both of them in person, so I was interested to look at their photograph, and that's a photograph Susan took in Tibet, and you can recognize the same pine sap is growing there. And this herbarium sample is very old, as you can guess. It belongs to herbarium of the British Horticultural Society in Kew Gardens. They keep a large herbarium, and this is one of the sheets. The samples were collected in Switzerland, so this is also a European plant. I wanted you to have a look at the herbarium sheet, because maybe some of you never saw any herbarium sheets in your entire life. And so you see, first of all, that there are very many inscriptions, notes, labels attached to these sheets, and 3 different barcodes, even 4 different barcodes. Well, this tells you how much work all in the herbarium collection is currently taking place. and the herbarium collection is kept for the specialists to look at it. And usually after a specialist works with the sheet that is preserved in the herbarium, he or she leaves a label that tells his decision regarding this plant, identification, and what has been done. For example, this label tells you that in 1973, this specimen was used as a part of a project of molecular genome sequencing of this species. And so this is now designated as a participant of that project. But other older labels are, of course, not that easy to read. They are illegible and they don't even have dates on them. And you see that the stalks of the plants are numbered 1, 3, and here is number 2. And the explanation is here in the corner. 1, 2, and 3 are actually different geographic areas from which this plant was collected at different stages of life span. And so this is not done this way anymore, because only one sheet should contain only a single sample from a single locality. You cannot combine 3 different localities on one sheet. But this is how it was done centuries ago in order to be able to illustrate fruiting and flowering, for example, on the same sheet. And that's why we have 3 different barcodes here. Each of them belongs to one of these numbers, 1, 2, and 3. And another interesting thing why I chose this particular herbarium specimen to show to you is that others never contain these clumps of, seemingly they look like clumps of soil with some protrusions from which the young plants emerge. And these are actually clumps of fungal mycelium or fungal hyphae with which the young plants are connected. And I found this herbarium sample is interesting in this respect because it's very unusual that you see this connection. This collector was trying to illustrate his understanding of what was going on with the plant. And usually it's collected like that without roots because there are no roots at all. Now, I showed you specimen from Europe and a record about finding of the same species in China. But the problem is that I couldn't even show you a worldwide map. So pine sap world range is illustrated here only in words. It is distributed in North America, Central America, in Mexico, in Europe, Southwest Asia, Russia, Mongolia, China, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Pakistan, Korea, Japan, Sikkim, and Thailand. So in all these countries, but for some reason I couldn't find anywhere the map illustrating all that. And I think I know why, because within the scientific community, there is no consensus about the volume, the size of this species. And this pine sap monotropa hypophysis is still very poorly understood. And so some botanists understand it in a wider sense and others in narrow sense. And in order to illustrate that, I ask you to compare these two maps. So this map is taken from the Flora of North America, which was issued in 2009. And you can see that it's looking just the same, almost the same as the map of for monotropa uniflora for Indian Park. That is, it is covering nearly the entire North American continent, except a small area in the north and northwest, and a very small area in the southwest. The rest of the American states and Canadian provinces all have dots in them, meaning that it occurs in that state or in that province. But here is another map that is taken from a scientific article of um, 2 years later, of 2011, that was published in Journal of Biogeography. And the authors of this article studied distribution and spread after glaciation of the same species. And you can see that this map looks quite different, and there are clear um, fragments. One is in the west, one big fragment in the east, and one small fragment in the south. And the rest of North America is not shown as having this plant. So that means that the authors of this article understood the species differently from the person who wrote the chapter in the Flora of North America. So the story is that in these plants that are cheaters, they used to call them parasitic plants, but this kind of outdated term. But in this group of plants that don't produce their own sugars and don't have chlorophyll, there are still a lot of gaps in science concerning these plants. We don't know about them very much. And scientists expect finding more cryptic species within a single species, meaning that within Monotropa hypophytis, which is pine sap, there are maybe a few different species that are hiding. We just didn't learn yet how to recognize them, but some of them have been recently recognized. For example, this one, Monotropa lanuginosa, this is called hairy pine sap. And you see the color is, first of all, you notice that the color is different. And then if you look closely, the entire plant is covered with this dense hairy cover blanket as if it's a little animal. And some scientists still believe that this is the same species, just pine sap. But here in New England, it has been recently recognized as a different species. And also, please pay attention to the date, August 24th. That means, and because this is my first sighting, the earliest sighting of this plant, I assume that this plant shows up on the day surface even later than pine sap. So if you put them in order, first thing you see at the end of June is Indian pipe. Then at the end of July, you see pine sap. And finally, only at the end of August, later in the season, you can find this beautiful bright pink hairy pine saps. They're really very festive. They have many flowers in a group, just like pine sap does. This photograph is taken in Walden, near Walden Pond in Concord. And you see that we are now in the leafy forest. So this one thing that can tell you that this is a different species is because pine sap is connected with pines, but this plant is not connected with pines. It usually grows under oaks and beeches. Again, another location, this is in Boxford State Forest, and you see that all this uh, oak and other leafy tree old leaves on the surface of the floor, forest floor. So it tells you that this has connections with different fungi. Just as pine sap and the Indian pipe, when it matures and the flowers become fruit, they become upright. So here is one stalk flowering, and the rest of them have already turned up, their heads up, and are becoming a fruit. And if you look at the leaves surrounding this patch of stalks, you see oak leaves, and beech leaves. So this is an oak beech forest on the shore of famous Great Pond. And this is the photograph you already saw at the very beginning of this presentation. This was my title photo. And you see that the date is October 13. It's already pretty late in the season. And here the this plant is in full swing, fruiting, and the fruits are plump, and the color is very piercing and beautiful. So it dries just the same as the previous two species, and in this dry form it keeps sending its minuscule seed all over the place around through these slots. And I was hoping to be able to show you the seeds of this species, but or at least some seeds of Monotropa, but the only ones that I was able to find were the seeds of pine sap, Monotropa hypophysis, the second one, the yellow one. That's what they look under the microscope, and the scale is provided by these white lines. In each photograph, this length of white line corresponds to 1/2 of millimeter. So you can imagine that this is the length of this seed is less than a millimeter. And by the way, these seeds were taken from herbarium sample that was collected in Lebanon. So that again tells you about this huge worldwide range of all these species. Finally, I wanted to be more complete with the review of this group and point out one more beauty that doesn't occur with us in Massachusetts here, but it occurs within the United States, namely in the southeastern part of the United States. And it's called sweet pine sap or pygmy pines. You can imagine with this name that it has very pleasant uh, honey odor. And of course, it's very beautiful. It's too bad that we in Massachusetts don't have this plant. So remember we were talking about how we can possibly imagine uh, the evolutionary development of this group of plants, how they could lose chlorophyll and become this group of achlorophyllous plants, that exist without producing their own food, their own sugar, and their own materials for construction of their body. So, of course, the scientific world has been concerned about their ancestors, their evolutionary roots. And I was trying to make to understand what is the current view on this subject in order to be able to tell you. But I have to disappoint you because there are as many views on that as projects have been undertaken. So some projects uh, tell you that the common ancestor uh, was green. Well, all of them agree on that. The common ancestor for this group was green, and then they lost chlorophyll. But which exactly was the common ancestor? They don't agree upon that. So I took one of those evolutionary trees, they call it, evolutionary tree, the one that looked more simple. And I'm trying here to present this idea to you. So this is what they use, molecular biologists use as a tool for building their evolutionary constructions. And this is called an evolutionary tree. And this is its root. Of course, it's only a simplification because it's not the real root. The real root is where the plants started way back down somewhere where the plants were separated from other groups of organisms. So this root starts whenever they decide to start it, depending on the object of the study. So here is a group of families or subfamilies that are closely related to our subject of our conversation. And so here is the group we are talking about. It comes from the word monotropa, so it's called now monotropoidea. So remember I told you that in biology you can tell the rank of the group by looking at the ending of the word. And so if it's ending in acia, it's a family. And this group used to be treated as a family. It was called monotropaceae, but now it is reduced to only a subfamily, a group within a big family, Ericaceae. So now it lost this ending acea, and now it's monotropoidea. So monotropoidea, according to this construction, they have a sister group that's called arbutoidea. And what they call sister group is another group with which they have a common ancestor. So there was some common ancestor from which both this bearberry and Indian pipe developed. And then within this group, there was not just Indian pipe, but also pine sap. So there are two major branches here. And then this group is a sister group to another, according to this construction, to another group, closely related group of plants, which are called wintergreens. Probably you are familiar with those beauties, spotted wintergreen. And then another closely related group of plants is one represented by broom crowberry. And we have been talking about this special plant, remember, that is fire dependent and occurs only in 2 places in Massachusetts. It's a rare plant in Massachusetts, a very early bloomer, very strange plant. So all these groups of plants, according to different ideas, different approaches, and different results of this molecular biologists, can be potential closely related groups with which Indian pipe has a common ancestor. There will be sister groups. And so our next conversation, we will talk about the sister groups of Indian pipes and see how they are related and what's interesting about wintergreens, bearberries, and broom crowberries. We'll talk about all these plants, and they are now united in one big family that's called ericaceous plants, ericaceous family. But when I was in school, they were all in different families. So each of these groups was treated as a different family. But whatever you call it, it's just cool plants, and I'm looking forward to talk more about that. And so you have this idea of which position Indian pipes and their relatives occupy within this larger group of plants. And so let's discuss these other plants later in the next talk. Bye for now. See you later.